I'm going to put something to you now. So you've got yourself, who was a fitness coach, strength and conditioning coach, moved into that recovery space, got into the PhD, academia, talked a lot about stats, been in front of Will Hopkins and getting a bit of a grilling there, but clearly having a grasp of that side of the industry. Have we gone too far that way with people getting passionate, let's say, about that statistical area and missing the first bit, missing that connection with the player, connection with the coach, bypassing that and getting too excited with the stats? Have I just described something that resonates with you, or am I just getting completely caught up in what I see? What do you think?
Yeah, not so much the stats.
Okay.
So I think this, from a statistical point of view, we have to. I mean, this is some work that I'm doing at the moment is trying to understand what is like meaningful, clinically important differences in measures. But I think we're 100% we're getting lost, caught up in data visualization and that end of things. And I've put that in the same bucket as being tech operators, and that's all that happens, or that's all people are taught to do. I mean, back in the day, I did the FA Fitness Trainers Award in whenever it was, 2009 and 10, which was your traditional sort of, if you want to work in football or in team sport, like these are the skills you need to have and the fundamentals. And that course to this day is the best. Like, I mean, aside from like institutional like degrees and stuff like that, that's from a outside of that bucket was that set me up hugely. And it's a shame that's no longer around. And I think Rich Hawkins was one who actually wrote that. And I do think we've moved so far away from some of the basics of sports science. I actually think we're like afraid to be scientists sometimes and to really question. Like we're problem solvers. We want to ask the right questions. I think if we're taught, and I say taught or influenced to go a different way or a different route and be behind a computer, and that's the main skill set of us as a practitioner, I think we're probably in big trouble, because it doesn't really matter if we can create something that looks amazing and is a new way of looking at something, if we can't even have a conversation with an athlete or understand that process and that question that we're trying to answer or investigate. So I think we have probably gone a little bit too far in that direction. Albeit some of that is very important. I think I would probably say that as practitioners, if we struggle to find impact or maybe job satisfaction, do we then search for the next or the nearest way or method that we can? And I think because of that, it's been probably about tech operating and I think like the GPS boom, albeit was good for the industry in terms of we could start to understand like external load, human locomotion, etc. It probably set up another like wave of, well, all we do is operate tech, and tech dictates what we do. And like it's tech dictating the science rather than let's start with the science first. And then can we find some tech that can help us? Not just using it because other people use it or because that's the trend. If we need a pen and paper as best to apply science, then let's do that. But I think there's also probably a fear or a expectation to use technology and to be like sexy in that space, I think. And I think it's got to take like confidence in practitioners and a group of practitioners to say, well, actually, I ain't going to use that. We don't need it. I'm going to do this. So I think that's probably where. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
I mean,
I think that's something that I think you probably as in your network and in the people you talk to and have on.
Yeah.
I think that's the interesting space, because I think we're talking about trends.
Yeah, 100%. Massive.
Trends.
Yeah, cultural trends. Yeah. I think, I mean, we spoke the other day about it, that kind of downward curve of people like yourself questioning these tools and going, do we actually need them, but just taking them for what they are rather than getting caught up in the trend. And I think there's certainly a trend now of, and I kind of go at it on social media with a little bit of a humor, because that's how I try to mask what I really think about these things. But there is definitely a trend of, taking hours and hours on learning R, or learning, even just the basics of spending hours and hours in Excel. And we've all been there, like the excitement of, getting a formula to work that's 5 miles long and seeing it do something automated. And it gets people going. But I think there is that obsession with that side, and that, that there's people in them roles now that is their job, and that's fine. But I think for someone like yourself, who has that fitness coach, the emphasis being on the coach, moving into that area, it's essential that people still keep that fundamental relationship building with players and with staff. And I know that's really fluffy, and that always gets thrown out there. Oh, relationships, communication, but it is that. It 100% is that. And it just going through daily life, you can see the people that don't have them kind of skills. You'll get on I don't know, you'll probably get it with people getting in touch with you, and you just have this image in your mind. I'm not quite sure that person's got the skills that I would hope someone would have in a position that is front facing, i.e. player facing or coach facing. So I think it's really difficult to get that balance. But you go on social media, you go on Twitter, and everyone's, and I took the mick out of this again a couple of months ago. You go on, you get sucked in. You go, oh my God, like everyone's doing this certain thing, whether it be in learning R, for an example, and not to batter anyone that is, and crack on. It doesn't particularly affect me at all, but it's just interesting where these trends go. And like I said to you the other day, is it the industry, i.e. employers, that are driving the trend, or is it influences within the industry, i.e. coaches or sports scientists themselves, driving the trend for a particular reason? Because there's a business behind it, or there is an ulterior motive. So I find that, like I said again to you the other day, I find that fascinating, where these things spring up from. If it's like, are we creating a need, or is there a need there that we're educating ourselves to plug? And there's various different situations that you could transfer that into. But I find that really fascinating, especially in this space, that education space of statistical programming. It's fascinating. I mean, put it back to you. What do you think? I mean, are we plugging a gap that is there, or are we creating this need ourselves, hoping that at some point it'll be needed?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I think there's certainly, I think if the whole continuum process is there, there's certainly a need for ensuring you have suitable reporting, visualization, etc. I think where I see it being a little bit confused and lost is that if it seems that's now the process, and what we've the whole from the beginning of dealing with people, being able to ask relevant questions based off the environment that you're in, understanding how best to answer those questions, and then who is your outcome, how are you trying to impact, or who are you trying to impact, and finding the best way or the best method across the whole continuum. Not just, well, let's start or let's create well, we don't really have control about this. So what I do have control is that if I have any sort of data, then I can just make it look or appear a certain way. And I think that probably came from the amount of data that GPS provides. Because with GPS, you don't have to do anything. You just ask the main thing you have to do. And to be fair, this is probably done by, I would say, people around my sort of era, if that's the best way to put it, and how we had to try and convince players to wear these things. Now it's normal. Like I had Dimitar Berbatov throwing it against the wall like I'm a traditional player. Like it's easy now to do that. So it's, well, we've just asked someone to wear something. We've just got a load of data, and now let's just try and create a visualization with that. I think, and without really a question in mind or a question to answer. And that's probably where the two for me interlink is the technology in terms of creating this wide and vast amount of data, and then us trying to figure out, well, what do we do with it? And so that is fine, but let's not forget about the whole process before that. Because if we do start to create this culture, industry, whatever you want to call it, then I think we're gonna probably get further and further away. Yeah, we may be able to create some brilliant looking reports and graphs, but so what if you haven't got the rest of it in place? So that's sort of my. And again, I think it's the whole social media thing and the trends, and I think creating insecurities with practitioners, and I think how best to put this, having a subject and creating confusion around that, going so deep within a subject that the expert in that subject only really understands, whether or not they do anyway, does that create an insecurity in other practitioners to think, well, you know what? Shit, I don't know anything about R or speed or whatever it may be. I don't know. That's maybe I'm sort of talking as I'm thinking, but I think people who do have a big influence on social media, including yourself as like the gatekeeper, I think it's interesting. It's fascinating to see how it plays out. But I think, to summarize, we shouldn't lose sight of that 0 to 80, 90% of what we are as practitioners, sports scientists, and how we actually impact the field.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're right in that with you saying about the gatekeeper. And I think it's kind of on the same lines as what I described earlier. But I had this thought over the last weekend, that the people that I get on the podcast are my decision to a certain extent, and that's feeding information to people that falls in line with who I want to speak to and what I think other people want to speak to. So I won't get a certain person on for whatever reason, and that's me choosing who people listen to. Like that freaked me out a little bit, because I've never really thought about it like that. And the reason it came about was the Twitter thing with Trump. Like Twitter deciding, and however you want to, like, I'm not there, so please, pardon my ignorance, but it's Twitter deciding that Trump ain't going to be on Twitter, and free speech and all that. And whether people agree with it or not, I'm not quite sure. I'm like in between. But then on the microcosm, I'm looking at myself and going, I'm the gatekeeper of this thing, this podcast. And I found that fascinating. Like, it was a little bit of a burden, but I'm happy to take it. But it's fascinating. You look around and you see other people of influence, and not to say I'm a person of influence, but people I get up that come on the podcast are people of influence. And do people realize the power they've got within the industry? And like I come back to before, is it something that's industry led, employers, or is it something that is practitioner led for a certain reason? And I think it's just figuring out. And people have been super critical, and it's something that I spoke to Paul Gamble about a lot. And it was been critical, not been cynical, because that's sometimes a fine line, but being critical of where you're getting information from, what the path is, how that's come around from that person or that organization, and just been a little bit not too hasty to jump in, but there we go. That I know I'm jumping around there, but I think that's
It's going to be interesting to see how it moves forward, how it progresses,
Yeah.
and certainly it's changing.
Yeah. So what was the transition like to the US for you? Because when that came out on social media, and social media being the be all and end all, of course, that caused a little bit of a stir, didn't it? It did.
Really?
Don't be humble. It did. Yeah.
I don't know.
What was the transition like for you? Was that always
Yeah,
was that always in the
it was.
pipeline for you to go across the states?
I think there's a few things. I think for number one, it was the hardest decision I've had to make. Obviously, there's obviously like I'm from the area, and the sort of being like a fan of the team, and it was my dream job. I got my dream job at 23. I progressed. I developed myself and in an area around sort of my research, and then I think with our jobs, like picking a geographical location is few and far between. I don't think we have that luxury really. If you want to be sort of solely focused on your career. So I always sort of knew that. And when I got that job initially, I was like, nothing. I'm putting everything into this, and like the old cliche, like relationships failed and all the rest of it. But yeah, it was the most difficult decision. But I think I was ready to progress, and I wanted to progress. Again, like through my time at Man United, I progressed every year, I thought, and maybe the last year I didn't. And I wanted to progress myself more into leadership and management type experience. I feel I was ready to put my footprint on a performance framework, a philosophy, with all the amazing experiences from coaches and fellow practitioners that I'd been exposed to. And the right at the time, the right opportunity came up. And as well, I thought, and I think Bryce mentioned this recently about trying to be involved in multiple environments. And from a sporting perspective, I was always the sort of like jack of all trades sportsman, and that interests me. But I think as well, like taking little bits of different sports, different environments, different types of people and athletes, that was a big thing for me. So the role of the Olympic athletes, there was obviously the Olympics around the corner, and I think as well sprinting becoming more prevalent with team sport, because team sport's my passion, but it was this emphasis on sprinting and the games becoming more powerful, more quicker, more intense. I think learning from athletes in the Olympic sprint world was something that attracted me to that role. And I'd always been someone who loved to travel and the challenge of experiencing a new culture and a new way of life. So it was difficult because I'd worked with, at the time, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, like he was the manager, and once he was there, I think from a practitioner side, my role had increased with him. Like I was delivering match day, like warm ups, and more from the S&C perspective again. Again, it was always that sort of fluctuation between different responsibilities, but that was something that I was doing under him. And I'd worked with him when he was with the club previously. Actually, at the time, we the under 23s didn't have a fitness coach or sports scientist to travel with them. So I, alongside my day-to-day with the first team, I'd do the sort of match day responsibilities with him then. So it was a big decision, but the time was right, and yeah, it was it was a big move.
Can you go into any of the detail around the things that you were doing with the sprinters, Olympic sprinters?
Yeah. I mean, it was really good because I don't think team sport and football, particularly 5-6 years ago, really give themselves or credit for how advanced they are from a performance, sports science, medical perspective. And I think going into individual Olympic sport, I think you can see the traditions that run high and the way things are done. And again, like human resource isn't huge for those types of sports. So you have typically one coach or one practitioner doing everything. And so they're required to understand information around these different entities of sports performance. But one thing in sprinting was that we didn't really know much about it at all. And so again, it wasn't about, well, let's focus on that pie in the sky question, which probably is going to take 20 years to answer. But let's get the basics right. Let's create a foundation to then innovate. And that's always been my perspective on innovation, because it's a word that gets bounded around a lot. And I think you need to have a good scientific foundation to then start to innovate. I don't think you can just, right, we want to try and quantify movement in relation to acute injury straight away. That's the end game, but there's a progressive pathway to that. So it was a great opportunity to start at the bottom and work our way up and understand the basic, like, what does training even look for an Olympic sprinter? What is the fluctuation of external load across a week? How do these athletes apply force into the ground? How does that change from a weekly basis? How do they respond to the different training blocks or the different physiological training attributes that are put on them on a weekly basis? And so, and again, one thing which I know I've spoke about was the one thing I don't think I did particularly well was integrate some medical monitoring processes or measures within a holistic, I would say, monitoring framework, or again, whatever we term it, a athlete healthcare management system. And so two great practitioners in Matt Tomey, who was doing this as part of his PhD as well, and also Jaz Randhawa, who was the main medical practitioner with the group. And so we were able to come together and really add those medical, again, and the more sort of extensibility anatomical measures, but just to have a look at how they coincide with some of the more traditional ones that I'd looked at before. Some of the more strength or power-based related measures, which again, very and highly relevant for these types of athletes who are creating huge amounts of forces. So bringing that together was something that we did, and I'm quite proud of how we did that. And again, some of the data that we collected, and which is part of Matt's PhD, will be out in forms of publication in the near future. So hopefully that adds to the body of work, but also how it can. One thing we were all, I think, we all thought about is how can this be relevant to team sport? So that was always in our sort of mind. It's like, well, yeah, we want to try and advance this sport and get athletes faster, essentially, but how can we translate that back into team sport? And that was always something that we thought about. And again, it was again, that work should be on its way out very soon. So
we'll come back to that in a minute, into that translation back into team sports. But can you give us any indication of the stuff that will come out in Matt's PhD? Maybe some high level insight into some of the questions that you mentioned just a minute ago. What training looks like, how that fluctuates, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to steal Matt's thunder.
Absolutely not.
It's his work, but one thing, again, like I said, we didn't understand load. Like for a sprinter, how do we define load? So we've looked at. I mean, there wasn't much GPS used in this sport. I'll be honest, it was almost frowned upon in terms of, well, is this relevant for for a sprinter, but it was something that we backed. So understanding how our athletes' perception of effort and load relates to the different thresholds or speeds from external parameters through GPS. So really understanding, well, what are these speeds or intensities that are actually really having an effect on a sprinter's physiology. So that was one of the first things. And again, another thing was what's not really been done much is GPS, and there's always been question marks over accuracy in terms of sprinting and change of direction, etc., acceleration. With these guys who are running quicker and faster than team sport athletes, we had the opportunity to sort of test that question. So we've done a lot of sort of methodological work around that. And then again, the next part was, well, can we find some relevant performance measures for these athletes? And if we can't, is there some surrogate markers of performance, adaptation, health that we can track across a long period of time, a season, to see actually how adaptation is changing, how fatigue is changing, or when fatigue arises with certain types of load. So it was basically building from the bottom up, with the idea, again, way in the distance of, well, can some of these movement parameters be linked to potential injury? But again, we have to get the building blocks there in place before we try and even go down that road.
Mm-hmm. Just coming back to the one thing that I only say it to remind myself that we're going to come back to it. That translation of that work into a team sport environment, and this next question brings me back probably 20 minutes to the trend. And if you're an educator in the speed area right now, like, it's booming, people are fully bought in, almost like obsessed with developing speed. And is that because of the team sports are moving quicker, workloads are higher, the speed of the game is getting faster, and people are therefore wanting to upskill in this area? But from the work that was done, how hard is it, from your opinion, to then translate that work, and how well do we understand it as an industry to take that work and put it in a team sport environment, put it in a Man United when there's 3 games, when there's Saturday Premier League, Tuesday in Moscow playing the Champions League, and then Saturday again at Stoke? You know what I mean? How are we there yet?
Yeah, like, so every day when I was working with these sprinters, I was like, right, what can I bring back into team sport? Like, that's my passion, and I'm going to be back in that environment in some way or another, probably. I think it's fair to say that's going to be the case, or that was the case. And so I was like, every day, what can I take from this? What can I learn and bring back into team sport? That was one of my sort of targets. And one thing for sure, I think how we implement speed or sprint training in a team sport environment is the opposite to what happens from a traditional track and field sprint environment. I think that needs to be stated. I think it's actually quite obvious for me, and I think it's up to people within those team sports to understand, I would say, the basics of maybe sprint mechanics and the technical model, dare I say that, of sprinting and acceleration. And then it's up to them, I think, to then best apply that within a team sport environment. I don't think it's up to people working in track and field to do that. I think that they can be great. I know James Wild and Jonas, like, they've been able to implement bits of what they do into that team sport environment. But I think it's up to, I think there's great practitioners in team sports, in football, in whatever it may be, who they're the best people. They're the best place to introduce or integrate speed training. And I think that's I think, really important to note. I think if they have the basics of understanding that area, I think they're best placed. I don't think it's up to a track and field coach to almost dictate how that should happen. I think they should be the ones who provide that basic information. I think it probably, at the moment, this goes back to the social media discussion, is that we have an area where we're delving so deep and we're going so like to the minuscule descriptives and facts of an area, and how speed can change or can be integrated, that I think we're probably creating a little bit of confusion for people, because when you are in that team sport environment, there's no way you can, if I think back to Man United, if you're working with fit players who are playing 3 games a week, like how do you introduce sort of technical sprinting technique training with them? I think it's very difficult. You may have, again, this is what I thought about every day, you may have an acceleration 3-4 reps max, maybe 2 days, a day before a game, as part of a sort of tapering strategy into the game. And so I'm sure there's certainly cues which can be used to remind athletes of the certain fundamentals of creating force and quickly and acceleration, etc. But if you only got 3 reps to work with, how can you sort of try and improve that? I think with rehabbing athletes, you have more time. And I think with the younger athlete or younger athletes, you probably have more opportunities to develop certain skills from a sprinting perspective. But I think we should maybe try and strip it back a little bit to, right, what are the fundamentals? Okay, done. These people who are working in the environment, they know the limitations of the environment in terms of time. And also, if you're working with a 30-year-old football player or soccer player, are you really going to try and, if you've only got potentially 10 seconds every week or every 2 weeks, are you really going to change how they move? I think that's debatable. So I think to summarize, I think the guys in the sprint world, I think can give us really, really good basic insights. And I think it's up to the team sport practitioners in that situation to then best prescribe how they use that.
Cool. Love it. Let's move into the present day with consultancy in NBA and Major League Baseball. And I'd just like to tie the recovery back into the present day as well. Your opinions on recovery now versus when you were at United, and anything changed, and how things have been implemented back then versus new environment with NBA and all the constraints that come with that, Major League Baseball, the obvious constraints that come with like the horrendous travel schedules and playing schedules. Where's your head at when it comes to recovery in these types of environments?
How long have you got? What a massive subject you've questioned me on here. So let's see if I can summarize this. So I'll start at the beginning. I think the way we've always looked at recovery from a research perspective, so the literature that we know, it's always been about, let's test one intervention, cold water, massage, whatever it may be, and let's use some generic measures of recovery, notably probably like performance tests, CMJ, a sprint, some other maximal sort of contraction-based assessments, strength-related, and see how they change or how they differ to either different modalities or nothing at all. And so when we were this is back 10 years ago. I was thinking, and again, very fortunate to have like the research side, Warren Gregson. We had the applied side. Again, this is at Man United, and it just seemed a little bit funny that we just like throughout the whole recovery process, that we know there's many origins of where fatigue is coming from, that we just use one thing and that would be the answer to everything. And so that made me think, well, let's try and understand what all these different interventions are actually doing physiologically. And that was the process. And so we started to then build out, again, going back to the monitoring, we were monitoring different systems, different biological components to how a human body sort of returns to homeostasis. So, well, what does cold water immersion actually do? What does massage actually do? What does a Normatec actually do? And then I think you can start to then branch off the various physiological areas. And so we went down that route, really. And it was like, after a game, the most important period, what's the most, and I would always call it, what's the limiting fatiguing factor at any given time point. And so after a game, you've got an increase in tissue temperature. You've probably got an inflammation cascade on the way. You've got swelling, you've got potential edema, you've got micro trauma. And so, well, what is something that can help that? So you go through your big list of interventions. So the one question you asked was, like, how's that changing now? That list is just getting bigger and bigger, rightly or wrongly. And then you start to match the intervention with what you think is occurring from a stress perspective. And again, monitoring links in. So you can monitor to unpick and figure out and quantify what is the stress. For example, if you're monitoring muscle soreness, that's giving you an indication of potentially inflammation, potentially micro trauma. And so that's giving you, albeit that's not the answer, that's building that puzzle where you start to put the pieces in place to better make decisions, rather than just say, you know what, either do what you want as an athlete, we'll come on to that in a minute, or, you know what, I like massage or I like Normatec, just do that. And again, so that timeline of recovery and the different origins of what's going on in terms of the system and biology, that changes as well. So you then enter a period where it may be more linked to, because that first period, a lot of it's more mechanical damage related to potentially sprinting, accel, decel, a lot of sort of like contractile trauma. And then the next stage, it may be more linked to metabolic disruptions. So how can we monitor that? And then how can we understand, out of our massive list now of interventions and strategies, what can potentially help metabolic fatigue? And so can we find a way of increasing circulation and increasing the circulation of potentially disruptive byproducts and metabolites to almost, check that box of, the most important thing at the start was the mechanical damage, and then we're moving on to metabolic fatigue. Let's find these group of strategies and apply them at the best position within that process. And that's not a generic process, because that changes to games, to training. It's so individual. As we know, like, athletes respond differently, not just between different athletes, but as an athlete, there's nothing to say you're going to respond the same to the same given amount of stress or load this week to next. There's so many variables that affect that. So it's very much a process which monitoring can guide. And that's always, again, going back to the monitoring process. That first low-hanging fruit was, right, we know what recovery, we have the best information to give us an indication of what recovery strategy to use at that time period.
Go on, mate, carry on.
Yeah, so no, go carry on.
No, I was just going to say, you mentioned about players just doing what they want, and you said you'd come back to that. That was clearly a bone of contention.
Yeah, no, so again, my role at Man United, I actually sort of sat in between the performance and medical staff as like this head of recovery and regeneration role. And it was fantastic because I got to see what the medical side and department thought of some of these processes and how they would attack recovery. And again, it was more from a therapeutic side. It was more about how can we make the athletes just feel better, which is again, that's a very important component of this process. But you have athletes who, for some reason, and I don't know why, performance recovery, athletes tend to know best about what they want to do. And that might be right or wrong. But if you're playing 3 games a week, or if in the NBA you're playing every other day. So if you have that short period between competition, or it's a critical time point, which again, in these leagues at the moment, particularly with COVID and increased frequency of games, reduced time between games, I think we should ask the question, are we happy to settle for what the player just wants to do, or from a therapeutic point of view, or do we actually look at what the stress is at that given time and from a scientific point of view, match the intervention best placed with that stress? And so this is the question. And I think there's certainly a balance between all those factors, sorry. But for me, if recovery and you understand your limiting fatiguing factor, then 100% I'm saying, well, if you're representing soreness, if you're representing a reduction in HRV, if you're showing me that there's a reduction in extensibility with a accompanied pain component, then I'm pretty sure cold water immersion in that given time point is going to be the best thing for you. So that's the question. Are we willing to sacrifice potentially that process for just an athlete just doing what they want? But I think, and again, I'm not saying it's one or the other. I'm saying, well, in critical time points, let's put the focus on that, on matching stress with interventions and strategies. But I think that's not just what we do. The athlete belief effect is huge. So if an athlete has a massive belief effect towards a certain strategy, then let's find a time point in that process to integrate that. And then I think if the medical team are involved, there's a therapeutic aspect to it as well. Let's find the best time to implement that process or that strategy. So it's all about working together. And that's something, again, through the time at Man United, it was always a very interesting way of working. And that's where I wanted to provide data, not to drive the whole process, but to give people like empowerment, almost like, oh, the data shows this. That means it's going to be cold water immersion. It's going to be hot water immersion. It's going to be whatever it may be, a Normatec or ECP or massage, or where's the best place to put these components. But again, when you do that, you have to be quite clever and smart in how others around that process receive it, and that you're not saying, well, you're not doing this doesn't work. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to say to the athlete, to the staff, these are the strategies we're going to use, and this is where we're going to place them over this timeline. And this is a dynamic approach. So that's sort of that's how we approached it, again, nearly 10 years ago. But I don't think much of that has changed. I think you've probably got athletes who you'd probably become more professional. But I think I tend to see two things. You see an athlete who just does one thing and that's it, regardless of what's going on or the symptom they're showing. It has to be ice bath every day. Or then there's the other athlete, again, I would say under the professional umbrella, who just does everything. They throw the kitchen sink at it. And again, sometimes, and again, one thing I didn't mention is the reason why there's a timeline for some of these different interventions, some of them are very contraindicated. So if we are trying to maybe reduce tissue temperature, reduce metabolism, reduce blood flow, then we know cold water immersion can do that. But don't then jump in a hot shower straight away, or then don't just then get in a hot tub afterwards in thinking, oh, well, I've done my ice bath. I think we need to start to really think, maybe as practitioners, as athletes, for sure, the reason you're doing that is to cool the temperature of your skin, and then the cascade after that is tissue, blood flow, metabolism reduced. Sorry. And again, that's maybe back to what we discussed before about educating the athletes. Because one thing that happens a lot is athletes become dependent on practitioners or strategies. And for me, it was always about give them the education, give them a decision-making tree in their mind. If I am sore, the easiest one, what they're feeling. If I am sore, I know to go this way. If I'm fatigued, I have heavy legs, I know to go this way. Rather than being dependent on a particular practitioner, process, or strategy. But it's becoming harder because for some reason, recovery falls into this weird hole of everyone knows like what works for them. Like that's like I used to get it all the time. Oh, I know it works for me. It's my body, which is I completely agree with. But it doesn't mean we can educate them a little bit to go down a different path. We're not taking anything away. We're just putting it what we think is the most logical sequence based on science. And again, like back in the day, like Ryan Giggs, for example, had a very bespoke recovery strategy for himself. And I ain't going to come in and say, by the way, you should start doing this. Of course not. But over the years, you're able to say, actually, well, maybe you could do this at this time. And then what you usually do it before, or like just tweak things a little bit. And I think that's where you start to get the trust. And then you start to move habits a little bit, and you're not changing them. You're just moving them into a more efficient and optimal way, in my perspective.
Nice, mate. Love that. Love that. Well, I've got one question for you because I know we haven't got loads of time before you've got to shoot. However, it's a big one. It may be briefer because of what we chatted about earlier. But where is the industry at to finish us off? Where is the industry at? And then I'm going to let you go because I know it's something that we wanted to have a little chat about. So we'll give it 5 or 10 minutes before I do let you get on with getting your hair cut. Yeah. Where's the industry?
You give me a lot of grief about his haircut.
You mentioned it. I know, talking about me. I know. It's bad, isn't it?
Lord of the Rings.
Sorry, mate. It's I've let myself go during lockdown. But yeah, where's the industry at?
Where's the industry at? I mean, I'm not sure my 2 cents is worth anything, but from my perspective, I know we've touched upon it. I think we certainly need to get away from technology dictating science. To some degree, I think we've kind of given up on being scientists and asking the right questions or the most relevant questions. I think we need to understand more and focus more on the whole process from a scientific perspective to how we report information or we interact with people. Like we discussed earlier, I think we're focusing more on that latter end because I think it's probably the most accessible. It's probably the right word. That it's the most accessible at the moment through this technology era and how we can sort of organize and bring together that information. So I would like to think that we maybe go back to the beginning, and not back to the beginning, but back to the start, and like we'll have confidence in ourselves to start to ask the right questions and develop that way, I think. But I don't know. I mean, I think social media is going to dictate a lot of that. Yeah. And I still think, I know university degrees, masters, etc., get a lot of bashing. I still think that's the good foundation of understanding in a sports science world, science. And I'm a big advocate of having a practitioner academic hybrid mindset. And again, for me, I describe myself as a coach or a practitioner who, in any decision that I make or any thought process that I have, I use scientific rigor in going about that. So I think I still think that's that's something that's required, I think, for practitioners who are up and coming and coming through this space and being bombarded with not only data, but these different avenues of how they can influence the industry. I definitely haven't answered that question, but I think that's probably a mix of my thoughts at the moment.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know. I think there's certainly, I mean, I always thought I'd be within a sports team and it'd be like the traditional pathway of moving up, basic practitioner, head of department, performance director, etc., etc. But I think there's definitely more opportunities outside of the day-to-day.
Definitely.
Different organizations that are starting to infiltrate health and performance and sports science. So I think from that perspective, I think it's exciting for people. There's certainly people in roles now who are outside that day to day, but have extremely exciting roles. So I think that's a positive. Yeah, I mean, where do you see the future of the industry?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's super exciting. I mean, you said it was pretty, I don't know, in the first 100 words about you work with Intel and other consultancy things that are outside of. I know you do certain things that you haven't touched on for whatever reason that are completely, almost look like they're completely removed from pro sport, and I think that's super exciting. I think people are slowly coming around to that fact because there's limited jobs. Not only because there's limited jobs and oversaturation of the market, but there is these other industries and other businesses that are seeing pro sport and want to pick up talent from pro sport and take it out and do cool stuff with them in their own industries. And I think that's super exciting. I think one thing that I'd encourage people, anyone, is to have that open mind of not just, I mean, you've had the tracksuit, you've had the best tracksuit in the world, and you've looked elsewhere and gone, I want to develop and I'm going to have to step away from this and do, work with Olympic sprinters, work in the NBA, work in the MLB, work for Intel. I think that's a really good message to send people that, yes, team sport and traditional team sport can be exciting and can be really interesting, as you've mentioned for the last couple of hours, but there is other things out there. And we've seen it recently with people stepping away and very publicly, like on LinkedIn, like I've just done too much, 60-hour weeks for 15 years at certain clubs, not seeing my family, I'm stepping away. And I think that's quite sad that we're seeing that. And I think more will come because, especially COVID, like seasons are getting packed tighter than ever before. That not only puts stress on players, but puts horrendous stress on staff. And we're only going to see that exasperated because people will be laid off, especially in the summer in the UK. We'll come to the end of the season, people's contracts will be up, and there naturally will be, I'm guessing, a decline in performance departments, and the kind of fat will be almost cut off these ever-growing performance departments. But there is opportunities there. There's opportunities there for people like yourself who go out and are open enough to go find it. And so I think that's super, super exciting. And what I'm really conscious of is putting this negative like shield around our industry, because there is a lot of rubbish, but there's also some horrendous opportunities, some horrendously exciting opportunities for people. It's just a matter of opening your mind up to accept them. And you've been a perfect example of that with the kind of stuff that you've done over the last couple of years since leaving United. So super exciting for me.
Yeah, I think it's about honesty as well, and like understanding and what you actually want from a role and where that satisfaction comes from.
I think it's having
the confidence to move out of the day to day and embrace something else. Because, like you said, there's loads out there. I think that people can sink their teeth into, but it's doing things for the right reason as well.
I mean, I've had a couple of messages over the last couple of weeks from people wanting internships in different countries. 2, actually. I think 2 come on the same day. I don't get these often, don't think I'm saying this, can I get them every other hour. But 2 particularly came on the same day and were wanting internships abroad because of various influences that seen. Like, I want to do a little bit of traveling, but I want to stay and do this. And I thought, how good is that? Like, how that's an experience, not only to get an internship, but to go and get an experience of living in the country. Like, for me, if I was employing someone and they'd lived in Australia for 6 months and then went to live in Bali for 6 months and did a 1-month internship, like, I'd choose that guy or girl over someone that's done a year's internship at a club down the road, because there's just so much more there so much more there as a person, that I'm like, I want to chat to this guy. Like, what was it like living in Bali for 6 months? Like, you've got a more rounded, not all the time, but potentially a more rounded character, personality, interested in different cultures, used to being around people that aren't like themselves. So yeah, I was super excited to have them messages and be, yeah, do it. Love to help, like, anywhere I can.
Yeah, and again, just like Bryce said, obviously a few weeks ago, I think that is when you are looking at practitioners or people, like if they've had that well-rounded experience, or they've taken the gamble to go into another one and something out of the comfort zone. I think that is commendable, and it offers another string to their bow as well. Of course, in some circumstances, people aren't able to be in that situation. But yeah, for me, I think it's certainly helped me as a practitioner and as a person, and just dealing with different types of people. I mean, I never worked with female athletes before until last year, and that's a whole different kettle of fish.
Yeah.
And so, but that's made me a better practitioner. And again, like, just learning from some of these athletes who can create ridiculous force so quickly, and it alters your mindset again of, well, if I go back into team sport, or when I'm assisting different support teams in team sport now, like, that gives me a whole other perspective on human performance and sports performance and how the whole thing interacts.
I'm going to let you go, but if anyone's got any questions for you, or wants to reach out about your consultancy stuff, your stuff at United, whatever it may be, where's the best place for people to get in touch?
Probably email robin.thorpe@live.co.uk, or Twitter, Instagram, the usual. Although Instagram's it's not really a work thing, but
walk in the desert and all that. So Twitter, do you know your Twitter handle?
It's Dr. Robin Thorpe.
Love it. Thank you very much.
Same.
Instagram's the same?
Yeah, with a period after the R, the first R.
Well, thank you very much. It was well worth the wait. You had me in the palm of your hand with the United stuff and the rest of it. It was class. So really appreciate it. It's great to finally make it happen, and pleasure to sit here and for 2 hours and have a chat.
Oh yeah, it's been good. Long overdue.
Worth the wait. Thanks, mate.
Cheers, mate.
Speak soon.